"Well, now we're off at last," said Frodo. They shouldered their packs and took up their sticks and walked round the corner to the west side of Bag End. "Goodbye," said Frodo, looking at the dark, blank windows. He waved his hand, and then turned and, following Bilbo if he had known it, hurried after Peregrine down the garden path. They jumped over the low place in the hedge at the bottom and took to the fields, passing into the darkness like a rustle in the grasses. Welcome to GM Tips episode 5. This is a series that I'm doing that is focused all on the One Ring role-playing game and my experiences of GMing this fantastic game. This episode is all about journeys, and obviously journeys are a huge part of the books, and similarly they have quite a high place in the games. They have their own subsystem and there's a big focus on them, much more so than other role-playing games. So I'm going to focus on journeys for this episode and kind of unpack some of the things that I've been thinking about when we've had journeys in our game. My first tip is to learn the subsystem for journeys and to make sure that you go through that process every time you have a journey. So if you want to make journeys a kind of a big part of your game, it's really important that you know the rules around them. They're not particularly complicated, but the more you know it, the more it will flow, and the more your players will get used to it, and they'll get into the groove of how it works, what the process is. So added to the kind of the rules, which is similar to the other subsystems, you have preliminary rolls to get bonus dice that you can use throughout that journey. There's also a little bit of planning on behalf of the players, and I think it's really important to focus on that when players start talking about a journey. So get them to, and they probably already are thinking about but get them to focus on the purpose of the journey. So they're going from A to B, but what's happened at their current destination to drive them to that point. So what's the kind of political context or the cultural context around their journey? So I just get them to focus on the purpose of the journey, make sure they've got a clear objective, that they know why they're going from A to B and what their expectations are around getting there, and who they're going to meet when they get there, what that kind of next step looks like, so that you can start to plan ahead and think about all of that stuff at the end of their journey that you kind of need to plan, manage, and then run during the session. The more they talk to you about the purpose of the journey and their expectations, the more information you've got to then shape something that they're going to like and get involved with. Think about it within the context of the campaign and what's happening elsewhere in Wilderland. How the various cultures are getting on, what's happening to them, their perceptions of other cultures, how friendly they're going to be and how welcoming, whether the adventurers have a reputation, those kind of things. Then go through the kind of the subsystem. So they have preliminary rolls, but they also plan a route, and in the rule book, players are supposed to be taking the adventurers' maps and actually using those to document their knowledge of the world. So they're supposed to be making notes on these and drawing on them, and that's fine if people want to do that. Then I'm sure that works really well. I've actually printed out PDF versions for my players. They don't tend to use them, but they do take extensive notes. I always make sure that I get one of the adventurers' maps out when they're in the process of planning a journey, because they're just so Tolkien feeling. The artwork is very reminiscent of the maps that Tolkien himself drew for the books, and they set the tone really nicely, and they give that kind of sense of scale and perspective that you're looking for. From a kind of logistical point of view, there are things you need to think about, like the route that they're taking, whether they would know certain things about that route, and whether they have an understanding of the terrain and things like that. The distance, they might not have an exact idea of distance. That's on you as the GM to manage that and to calculate how long it takes and the difficulty of the terrain. There's also the darkness of the lands and how the chance of them being blighted, how hazardous they might be. But also think about the weather. So Tolkien used weather a lot, and he focused on the landscapes and the weather, but also on the characters within that landscape and that weather and season. Focus on the time of day as well. So it might not be a sunny day when adventurers set off. Maybe there's something else going on. What kind of tone do you want to set as the GM? Perhaps it's early spring, but it's really rainy, and the sun for some reason just doesn't seem to light up the sky in the way that you would hope it would at that time of year. What kind of wildlife is around? Are there birds singing? Are there foxes passing through? Are there fish jumping in the river? Just things you can start to kind of piece together to just bring stuff to life a little bit. Also, the level of threat that's ongoing in your campaign. Have an understanding of where you are in the timeline and specifically what's going on in the locations that you're managing. Where we're at in Darkening of Mirkwood, in theory, it's kind of 10, 11 years after the Battle of the Five Armies, so there aren't huge war bands of orcs wandering around, but there are kind of, occasionally there'll be goblins, but certainly there are risks from spiders and wolves and brigands and all of those kind of things. So think about how you bring those things in as hazards and make sure you know the rules around triggering hazards. It's not a complicated thing. Just be aware that you're kind of, as a GM, you're looking out for that, almost hoping really that one of these kind of little hazards that you've hopefully prepared in advance is going to be triggered. There's some really good suggestions for hazards in the Journeys and Maps book. It's a very slim, slender book, but the stuff that's in there is really good in terms of just giving you ideas around hazards and bringing the world to life a little bit. So have a look at those things. Additionally, think about in your planning as a GM, think about possible encounters and NPCs, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And my second tip is to refer to and take inspiration from the source material, because Tolkien was really a master of writing journeys for his characters, and in fact you could argue that The Lord of the Rings is a story about a journey. He used journeys to bring landscapes to life and weather and place those characters within those landscapes to give that sense of epic myth. Tolkien also took inspiration from the world around him, so he walked a lot around his own home and took inspiration from the lands that he saw on his journeys. So definitely do that, definitely get outdoors as much as you can and just think about the world that you're seeing around you. I'm really lucky to live in a great part of the UK which has the Peak District around it. So we have, just beautiful hills and craggy edges, wonderful dales and valleys and, rivers and streams. And it's just an incredible, magical place to explore. And I often find myself when I'm out walking with friends, I find myself thinking, okay, what bit of Middle Earth would this be? So it's a great way to kind of just get some ideas to use to describe the world that your player characters are navigating on their journeys. So as an example of Tolkien's love of journeys, I just want to get into a little bit of detail on one small journey from the book, The Fellowship of the Ring. Now, this starts on page 70 of my book, my edition, and finishes on page 85. So you've got kind of 15 pages of one small part of a slightly bigger journey. The bigger journey being that Frodo, Sam and Pippin want to go to Buckland to meet up with Merry. This journey, or this part of the journey, takes them from Hobbiton to Wood Hall, and it's a journey of around 50 miles. And just to give you an idea of how much goes into this this journey, Tolkien starts by describing the Shire, or Hobbiton. So he describes the fields, the hedgerows, the lanes, the coppices, the rivers and the bridges, and it feels very Shire-like. It's very safe. He places the characters within that landscape by describing how they interact with it. He writes, "Since they were all hobbits and were trying to be silent, they made no noise that even hobbits would hear. Even the wild things in the fields and woods hardly noticed their passing." So you can use this kind of technique to place your player characters into the landscape during a journey. So you, as a GM, are perfectly within your right to almost take control of your player characters in a very passive sense. So you can describe for a short time how they interact with the world, their approach to travelling, how they feel, how the world around them makes them feel. Players are not going to object to that as long as you're not kind of actively trying to achieve things during that journey. And Tolkien uses that kind of narrative lens of zooming in and zooming out from individual actions and kind of minor conversations into sweeping descriptions of the land as the hobbits pass through it. And it's a really great technique for kind of making a journey feel like it has momentum and that it has scale and importance. He breaks the journey up, so the hobbits walk for 3 hours, then they rest. After that rest, the trail becomes a little bit harder, the sky's darker, the landscape is more threatening, so Tolkien starts to amp up the pressure a little bit through the landscape and through the weather. And the hobbits react by starting to get closer together, they hum tunes and they talk to each other to keep their spirits up. So in a very subtle way, Tolkien is suggesting the presence of a threat. Tolkien then reminds the reader of the plot through dialogue. He does a bit of exposition and reminds the reader that we're about to meet Merry. We've got 2 days to get to Buckland. At that point, they make camp at the foot of a fir tree. They sleep, and a fox comes up and investigates them and moves on. There's very small little moments that Tolkien just brings in to add colour and to add feeling to this journey. So it's much more than just getting from A to B. The next day, the journey gets harder, and Tolkien describes hillier landscape and it's warmer weather. The packs feel heavier. There's much more description of the landscape and the place of Woody End as the hobbits start to near Wood Hall. At that point, Sam floats the idea of elves appearing, and Sam's got this fixation on elves. So, you know, this in game terms, you could be empathizing and listening to your characters, to your players really well, and understanding what their motivations, what their hopes are. I have a player in my group who's really keen to meet Legolas and then go on to meet Thranduil and go to Thranduil's halls. Well, that is all set up to be part of a journey, and that's going to be an encounter with an NPC. So Frodo starts to sing a song, and he's calling readers back to Bilbo's adventures in The Hobbit. So linking those two things, which is just an amazing technique there that Tolkien's got. Frodo starts talking about Bilbo and saying that Bilbo always said there was only one road, and that the road leads ever on to all of those places of adventure. And Frodo says that this road that the hobbits are on right now leads to Mirkwood and even to the Lonely Mountain and back to Bag End. So a really great kind of call back to the adventures in The Hobbit and placing it within this moment. Then there's a hazard. So the hobbits encounter a black rider on the road and they hide. In game terms, this would be triggered by the lookout, probably. Would involve some kind of stealth test or certainly awareness and then stealth. and you could make this quite a low target number because you don't want the hobbits to be caught by a Black Rider right at the start of the journey. They hide, the Black Rider moves on, and Sam gives us a bit of exposition about the Black Riders. So this is this hazard has kind of triggered a whole load of narration about the campaign, essentially. He starts telling Frodo about one of the Black Riders speaking to the gaffer before they actually left. This also adds pressure and starts turning up the sense of danger for the hobbits. They set off again. The descriptions of the landscape become even more ominous, and the trees are long and thin, the grass is thick and tussocky, and the ground is uneven, so harder to navigate. They start to reach Woodhall, and they spot the lights of Woodhall. They stop for a meal. There's a lot of description of the stars, the sky, the wind sighing in the branches, and the hobbits start to walk along side by side with each other for comfort in step. They hum and sing to lift their spirits. Again, really nice to have that kind of lens focus away from the world around them, that larger scale, back to the characters and how it makes them feel and what they do to interact with the world. Then there's another hazard. They have another brush with a Black Rider. Frodo almost uses the ring. And then a group of elves appear. We hear them before we see them, singing and laughing in clear voices, and the Black Rider retreats. This essentially is an encounter with a NPC, so a really important character in the whole timeline of Middle-earth, Gildor Inglorian, and his group of wandering elves, who are probably heading west to leave Middle-earth at some point, although they're kind of ranging around the Shire before they do. They accompany the hobbits and have an interaction. This encounter lasts 5 or 6 pages and leads to a number of outcomes. So Frodo actually speaks Elvish to Gildor at one point, Elvish that he learned from Bilbo. So in game terms, that might be a custom role. You could explore that with song, those kind of things. And Gildor responds by first of all adding a bit of colour. They discuss Bilbo, and Gildor says that he's seen Bilbo a couple of times since he left the Shire. And then Gildor promises to inform other elves, the wandering companies of elves, of Frodo's journey, and says that they will offer their protection wherever they can. So that's a really kind of positive outcome in game terms. You've earned the protection of wandering elves by using custom and being polite. And Frodo certainly leads that interaction with the elves. The other characters, Pippin and Sam, are just on the sidelines really throughout that. In the morning, they're refreshed and they continue the next stage of their journey. So you can see that's a huge amount of narrative time and effort for a small part of a larger journey, but really key way that Tolkien uses journeys to illustrate the world and the characters that inhabit it. My last tip is really simple again. Use the spotlight. So role-playing game Spotlight focuses on you as the GM because you're narrating the journey. Players will be quite happy to take the back seat and have a snack or sit there and listen and take a few notes while you narrate this journey to them that brings the world to life. And make sure you've got their attention. You don't really want people having sidebar conversations or run into the fridge to get drinks during this moment. Kind of use the planning part of the journey to reiterate the importance of it and get them engaged with it. Describe not only the landscape and the world around them, but also the movement of other minor characters that they're probably not going to interact with, fellow travellers who maybe just want to say hello and good morning. Perhaps exchange information a little bit, but describe the characters and their approach to the journey. So are they kind of bracing against the wind? Are they helping each other climb? what are the characters doing within that landscape? So everything that we've learned from that example that Tolkien gave us, just use description as a way of taking people on the journey with you, and then break it up with interactions and hazards along the way. And the hazards that your players trigger during journeys as they make their fatigue tests should be relevant to the character's role. So I think in the rules, actually, it says whenever a hazard is triggered, you just pick a role at random, and then that hazard is applied to the character that's in that role. To me, that doesn't really make much sense. So the way I play it is, if a player triggers a hazard, then the hazard is relative to or relevant to their role. So if they were a scout, then it's going to be something about spotting some tracks or not seeing something and being surprised and ambushed in that way. It just makes it more personal and more impactful on that player. But more generally, think about the landmarks they're going to see and explore, possibly the things they might do along the way, and the characters that they might meet. And a really good way to break a journey up and to make it important and relevant is to introduce an NPC during that journey and run that as an encounter, because that's going to be really important. So depending on how the characters approach that interaction and that encounter, there might be a different outcome. So if you introduce a very important NPC like Gildor Inglorian, well, if the players approach it in completely the wrong way, they might not make an ally out of Gildor. They might offend him, and he just goes off and tells the elves that, let's not help these people. But if they handle it in the right way, that could have a huge impact further down the line. That will be more rewarding for players when that comes to fruition and it pays off later in the game. Use journeys to allow them to meet new characters and explore new places. And in short, I'd say that journeys can bring a sense of discovery for your players. So they're going to find new places, they're going to discover little things along the way, and hopefully meet new people, which will make it much more interesting than just getting from A to B. That's about it for this episode. I didn't want to overload it. I just thought it'd be really useful to remind ourselves that there's some great inspiration in the source material. So keep looking at the source material. There's a lot of inspiration you can get from Tolkien's description of journeys and the way the characters behave on those journeys. And my key takeaway, if you only take one thing away from this video, is to throw in a important encounter into a journey, but don't do it every time to the point where it just becomes a routine thing. But it's a great way to break up a journey and make the act of getting from A to B really important and impactful on the wider campaign. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and thanks for your comments and feedback. Keep them coming, and see you next time.